The message arrived without ceremony, a single sentence that ended a marriage, more efficiently than any lawyer could. Do not be home when we get back. Once it is old, it is dead to me. He was speaking of her, of the woman who had built his life, beam by beam, belief by belief. That night, she did not cry. She drafted, she measured. And when dawn came, she signed one final order, not for revenge, but for demolition. If love had died within those walls, she would bury the house beside it. The phone lit the inside of her palm like a small, indifferent sun. The message arrived as if it had always been waiting to be composed. Do not be home when we get back. Once it is old, it is dead to me. Evelyn Shaw read it 3 times, not because she did not understand the words, but because she wanted to measure them as one measures the load on a beam slowly, deliberately, until the meaning settled in the bones. She sat in a rental car at the curb across from a construction site where men in hard hats were taking down an old office block with the same precision she applied to design. An excavator arm swung with quiet choreography, removing a wall, then another, leaving only the ordered ruin of what had been useful. Dust rose in slow gray curtains and settled in the grooves of the street. For a moment, Evelyn watched the demolition as though she were reading a blueprint of a life. Unraveling, she opened the photo attached to the message. Daniel stood in the middle, arm around a woman she did not know well enough to hate yet, but soon enough she would learn every angle of that face. Around them, like ornaments in a display, were her family members. Her mother, Margaret, wore a lavender dress and a smile that had once sought to soften every sharp thing Evelyn felt about herself. Her sister Anna held a bouquet as if she had been drafted into a role written to comfort strangers. Her brother Ethan laughed with the careless hunger of a man who had been fed more than his share of second chances. Evelyn's breath left her in a small, even sound. She put the phone down and let her hands rest on the steering wheel, the leather cool beneath her palms. For 3 seconds, she did nothing more than count the beats between one inhale and the next. She did not cry. She did not speak. She memorized the photograph the way one observes a building before drawing the first line of renovation, noting the angles, the load-bearing points, the parts that will not hold. Architecture had taught her to see in layers. She read a living room like a site survey. She read truss like an inspection report. She had learned to translate the sentimental into the structural. Tonight, those habits served her like armor rather than the soft cloth of consolation. She zoomed into the photo until the pixels sharpened into a map of small betrayals, the way Daniel's tuxedo fit too well, the hand placed possessively on the woman's waist, the champagne glass tilting in a toast that sealed an absence. Her office at Shaw and Company had been her workroom and her pulpit. She had built its reputation. The Harborview Tower that dominated the waterfront was the kind of project that announced itself in columns of light and in articles quoting her with the careful reverence paid to makers of cities. She knew how to draft a skyline and how to defend a design. What she had never learned until that message was how to defend a private life. 3 hours earlier, she had been giving a presentation to a room full of investors and council members. She had stood before a model of Harborview, fingers dusted with plaster, voice steady. Natalie Reed, her project lead and oldest friend, had watched from the second row with an expression that was equal parts admiration and concern. Evelyn had answered questions about load distribution and the public plaza with the same calm she now applied to the photograph. She had left the meeting with congratulations and plans. She had gone to her car expecting papers and an evening of drafting revisions. She had not, in any measurable timeline, expected this. A brief flash carried her back 16 years. She and Daniel at a mutual friend's party. He had laughed at a joke that made her forget the measurement lines on the napkin in her lap. He had seemed, in that thin slice of time, a man not bent on making his exit. They had dated. They had married in a small ceremony where she had chosen the venue because of the light it caught at dusk. She had believed, like one believes in good materials, that love could bear weight. There had been small fractures then, as there had been in every structure she had repaired. Daniel took sales trips that lasted too long. There were nights when he claimed the office and smelled of hotel linens the next morning. He became practiced in the language of absence. He was too busy. He had to be in 3 cities at once. He was tired. Evelyn had accepted these as maintenance. She had justified his absences as part of a life that required time zones and negotiations. She had been building a future, and she had assumed he was laying bricks beside her. He had not been. The construction site across the street kept its private rhythm, men shifting, beams collapsing with the sound of sanctioned ruin. Evelyn found herself cataloging the demolition as if it were a rehearsal for what she might do to prevent future collapses. She counted permits in her head. She thought in the careful terms of liability and title. If the facade was gone, what remained would be foundation. What if the foundation belonged to whom the seed of suspicion had been planted weeks earlier? An almost imperceptible tilt in a ledger. Daniel's stories about the regional office had been too fragrant with travel itineraries and praise. Once she had caught his laptop open on the kitchen counter when he had stepped into the shower and unlocked screen. A name in the conversation list. She had seen Clara. She had filed that moment away with the same professional detachment she had for a structural anomaly. She had not yet measured it for its full consequence. On her kitchen counter that night, she had opened the browser history of a device she had every right to access and found reservations and receipts that did not align with his reported schedule. A late-night credit card notification flagged an unfamiliar hotel. Strange vendor names appeared next to charges. She had uploaded the screenshots to a password-protected folder and then closed the lid because some truths, she thought, deserved to be confirmed before noise. She had returned to her model work and to the rhythm of deadlines. Now the evidence arrived in the form of a wedding photograph and a sentence that cleaned the last of the dust from the beam and showed the rot beneath. Evelyn's eyes moved methodically across the image as an architect moves along a wall. She noted the family, the lighting, the caption Daniel had posted beneath the photo, a line about starting forever in paradise. And she felt the queasy tilt of a person who has discovered that the ground beneath her feet is shifting. She drove the rental to a corner cafe and ordered coffee with hands that did not shake. The barista handed her a cup and asked if she wanted room for cream. She said no. She wanted the coffee as she wanted everything that evening, black and clear. Natalie arrived within 20 minutes, all professional cheer and half-hidden worry. She sat across from Evelyn with a quiet that meant she knew some things, but not all. "We should call Claire," Natalie said after Evelyn had shown her the photograph. Claire was the name of the lawyer who had once told her, in a tone both fierce and practical, that a postnuptial agreement was not a prophecy of failure, but a safeguard of investment. Claire had been insistent the day Evelyn had expanded her firm. She had been right about many things. Evelyn listened. She said little. Her mind worked through the sequence of actions like one assembles a construction timeline. First, confirm. Second, protect. Third, act. Natalie suggested denials and confrontations. Evelyn cataloged the options with the calm of someone drafting alternates for a risky beam. Emotional pleas distracted from the necessary steps. She did not know yet whether she felt anger or grief. She knew she felt the clinical clarity of a person who had turned suspicion into a project. Back at home in the quiet of an apartment she had chosen for its high windows, she opened a drawer where Daniel kept the miscellany of keys and receipts for a life they had ostensibly shared. She was not looking for drama. She was looking for evidence. Among the discarded menus and old insurance cards, she found a manila folder with his handwriting on it. A handwriting she could identify in the same way she could recognize a signature line. She had drawn across a set of plans. The folder contained a ledger she had not expected. There were entries for wire transfers and dates, and also scanned copies of documents labeled with a lender's letterhead. Her finger traced the line item that made her feel the floor tilt. A proposed second mortgage application, 3 attempts. Dated 6 months earlier, each stamped by a local bank with the terse word declined. There were annotations in Daniel's hand, and beneath them, an unfamiliar scrawl that was not his. A signature line had a flourish that did not match his steady print. Her breath measured out in a slow count. This was no longer simply an affair. The entries suggested a plan of extraction to convert the equity she had held in the house held in the name of the company. She had found it into a fund for a different life. There was even a line in a forwarded chain of emails that read, casually cruel, "Once I get the money from the house, we can leave sooner." She will never know until it is too late. The voice on the recording, if she found it, might be indistinct in a courtroom. In that kitchen, it was as clear as if she had heard it aloud. Evidence does not feel dramatic at the moment of discovery. It feels practical. It feels like blueprints and receipts and constrained air. Evelyn understood what the documents implied. She understood what agendas lay behind the polite sentences and emails. This was not a private betrayal. It was an organized plan to appropriate value. The tilt in the ledger was a lever aimed at her dot. She did not close the folder. She laid it on the table and sat down on the edge of the counter, the world contracting to the steady line of her pulse and the quiet that follows a truth landing. She allowed herself a single thought, precise and steady as if scribed in a margin. If this was true, then it was not just betrayal. It was a plan. She did not, in that moment, decide to rage. She did not call her mother to shout. She did not run to the door. She rose instead with the measured step of someone who knows how to convert emotion into design. She would confirm. She would document. She would speak to Claire. She would not act as if demolition were a whim. She would, if necessary, orchestrate. It with the same care she used when she specified the grain of a countertop. Outside, the demolition across the street continued. The excavator's arm struck a load-bearing wall, and the building sighed and surrendered a floor. Dust fell into the gutter like the first small measure of consequence. Evelyn watched it and, for the first time that night, made a plan in silence, tracing lines not only on paper, but through the life she had been given to steward. She could not yet see the architecture of what would come next, but she could begin to draw the site. She carried the photograph like one carries a small, precise tool. It was folded in her mind into exact angles and measured truths. The tilt of Margaret's smile, the tautness of Daniel's tuxedo, the way Anna cradled that bouquet as if it were a prop in a play. In the glass of the cafe window, the city moved as it always had buses. A man walking a dog, light catching the river, unaware that one life beside the harbor had altered its lines. Natalie arrived like a wind that knew the shape of storms. She did not ask Evelyn to recount the photograph's details. She sat, took the phone without needing to be told, and scanned the image, her face hardening in the places Evelyn had already marked. Natalie's reaction was not theatrical. It was professional, a raw and steady appraisal that mirrored Evelyn's own. "We call Claire," Natalie said. The lawyer's name landed between them with the force of a mallet on a bench. Claire Morales was not the sort of attorney who offered consolation. She offered instruments. She had helped Evelyn arrange the company when she incorporated the house as an LLC. She had, on that uncomfortable afternoon 5 years earlier, insisted on a postnuptial agreement. Her insistence then had felt clinical and cold. Now it seemed prescient. Evelyn watched Natalie's mouth, as if it were a dial she could turn. "I want to confirm before we do anything loud," she said. "I want to know what is real." Natalie nodded. She had always been the voice that cut to the structure of a problem. "We do that," she said, "but we do it carefully. No confrontation until we know." Careful was a familiar posture for Evelyn. Architects learned early the language of caution: measure twice, cut once. Survey, substantiate, schedule. She paid the bill for the coffee with hands that did not tremble and returned to the car, with Natalie's steady presence filling the silence like a brace. Back in an apartment whose floor-to-ceiling windows kept the harbor like an exhibit, Evelyn set the photograph on the dining table alongside the manila folder she had pulled from Daniel's desk. The folder, which had felt at first like curiosity, had become an axis. She opened her laptop and began to catalog. Her access was not presumptuous. She had, through routine and trust, been granted administrative privileges on several shared accounts. Early in their marriage, ease had overridden suspicion. There were email accounts, joint cards, subscriptions. These were not treasures as much as architectural elements of a shared life. She clicked and sorted and saved. For every travel reservation she found that matched Daniel's story, she marked a green check. For every hotel charge that did not align, she highlighted in red. In the nights that followed, she worked like a woman auditing a structure. The laptop screen cast a blue light that felt like an inspection lamp. She pulled digital copies of receipts, exported bank CSVs, and used software she knew well enough from the firm to run quick reconciliations. The process was meticulous and cold. She created folders titled with dates. She named files to survive discovery. She did not let emotion dictate how she filed. Forensics was a language of patience. It was also a grammar that required the right verbs. Claire, when she arrived, moved through that grammar with a practice blade. Claire's office was on the 14th floor of an office building that looked as if it had been built to show confidence. Claire did not offer tea. She opened a manila folder, placed a stack of documents between them, and folded her hands. "You did right to bring this first," Claire said, not looking up. "Evidence, documentation, screenshots, receipts. Keep everything in its original files. We will subpoena backups and headers. Once we do, we will have server logs and IP addresses. That is how we begin." Evelyn listened and made notes as if turning numbers into beams. "Time frame?" she asked finally. Claire's eyes were a ledger open to a particular page. "Subpoenas and discovery take time. Weeks, sometimes months. For now we secure, freeze joint accounts we can. Create new accounts for your business. If there are pending transfers or suspicious withdrawals, we can seek temporary restraints. I will prepare a petition. Abandonment, adultery, attempted fraud. The forged documents, if authentic, bring us criminal exposure to his actions. We will not make allegations we cannot prove." Her legal language felt slower than Evelyn's need to move, but it possessed its own rhythm. It was necessity dressed in procedure. Claire outlined a sequence that sounded rationally exhausting: file for divorce, secure assets, serve the papers, subpoena Daniel's professional accounts, retain a handwriting expert, secure forensic IT. Each step had its own time, and each time mattered. Evelyn left Claire's office with a list of actions and a new sense of the dimensions of what she faced. She measured the things she controlled and the things she did not. Her father, George, called that evening. His voice made itself small across the line. "I do not understand everything that is happening," he said. "Your mother, she said you had been distant. I thought you thought wrong," Evelyn answered, and she did not let herself soften. She did not need it to be explained or excused. Each sentence from him was a thinly veiled regret. George was a man whose default had been silence. He had been soft, amenable, often reticent to cross his wife. Now his voice carried the weight of information that had been kept from him, as if it were something to be rationed. "I will come by," he said, "if you want." "No," said Evelyn. She had work to do, and work kept her present in a way conversation could not. Not tonight. She made other small changes that felt like shaping a perimeter. She had the locks changed on her office and placed a new set of digital credentials on accounts, where she had been listed as a secondary. She arranged that statements would be sent not to the house, but to her company's registered mailbox. The house itself, Willow Crest, had been titled in the name of Shaw & Co., LLC, an arrangement Claire had drafted to protect the firm's assets. That structure would, if properly marshaled, be a vector of protection. Amid these acts of containment, there was a steady, clinical hunger to locate the exact leverage point. The ledger entries in the manila folder had revealed loan applications, and most alarming, a series of emails that suggested Daniel had attempted to secure a loan against the house under the pretext of joint ownership. The title, as Claire had explained, resided with the company. Legally, he lacked direct claim unless he could prove some contribution or prior agreement. There, Evelyn suspected, lay his strategy: create the appearance of shared title and then use the presumption of ownership to extract capital. The first step was not an accusation shouted across the lawn. It was an audit. Evelyn hired an independent title researcher who ran the chain, confirming documents and noting the LLC's registration date. She arranged for copies of mortgage statements. She collected canceled checks and recorded transfers from her own accounts. She worked in the precise way she designed foundations: gather materials, measure, and test.
When she found the copies of the rejected loan applications folded into Daniel's desk, the paper had the sober stamp of bank letters labeling them declined. The bank's name, the dates, the reasons, it was all there. Someone had tried to secure funds by misrepresenting ownership. There were annotations, Daniel's handwriting in the margins, his attempts to retrofit excuses. In the margin of one application was a line in a different hand, a flourish that did not match his hand. That flourish was a small, treacherous signature. Forgery is not uncommon in domestic cases, Claire said when Evelyn showed her the pages. But it is not trivial either. If we can show an intent to defraud, if there is a sequence of attempts to misrepresent title or ownership, you are looking at both civil remedies and a potential criminal referral. The forensic experts will examine ink pressure, pen strokes, and any digital traces. Most of this is routine in white-collar domestic fraud. The words routine landed like measured bricks. Fate was built little by little, clause by clause. Evelyn felt the slow satisfaction of a plan taking shape. Not the violent satisfaction she had once imagined, but the kind that architects feel when a nuisance detail resolves into coherent design. She did not make one error of haste. She understood that to win, she would have to build an incontrovertible case. She asked Claire to issue preservation letters to Daniel's employer, to insist they retain laptops, servers, and email headers. Claire complied in the manner of a surgeon setting instruments in order. While the legal scaffolding took shape, Evelyn confronted another necessary complexity: demolition. She had watched the controlled collapse across the street until that choreography had ossified into an idea. But she did not imagine miraculous permits or a favorable set of officials bending a rule to her whim. She had too much respect for procedure to confuse will with process. Instead, she performed an appraisal. She called an engineer she had used for Harborview. They met on the site at Willow Crest and walked the property in that dry October light. The engineer peered into the crawlspace with a headlamp and nodded. A foundation crack ran along the eastern wall. Damp had shifted where a masterful resurfacing had hidden the problem. There had been earlier renovation structural compromises patched rather than professionally reconstructed. An older roof, original materials hidden behind new siding. When the engineer spoke, his tone was not dramatic. It was exact. There are areas, he said, that, if left, will become a serious hazard. A comprehensive report could support an expedited permitting where public safety is demonstrably at risk. That requires inspection logs and a code officer's concurrence. It is not a given, but it is a path. This was the kind of path an architect appreciates: technical, data-driven, bound by specific checks. If Evelyn intended to clear the site, she would do it by evidentiary steps, not theatrical gestures. She also spoke to Jack Thornton, a contractor who had built and unbuilt more Boston houses than she cared to count. Jack was pragmatic and rude about timetables in a way that made her steadier. His trucks did not work on feelings. They scheduled by availability and permit, 4 to 8 weeks, depending on asbestos survey, permit backlog, and disposal logistics, Jack said. If you are short on time, you can prioritize escrow, expedite, pay premium. But asbestos and hidden structural failures will slow anyone down. I will not run a site that will leave a mess and a liability. Evelyn asked questions that sounded like architecture and law braided together. How long for an asbestos test? What did an emergency permit look like? How quickly could a title transfer allow a developer to step in and proceed? Jack answered in measures and rates. He offered options. He told her honestly what shortcuts would cost and that some shortcuts were not legal at all. There was one more person she needed in the room. Tom Hardy was a developer in town known for buying challenging lots and building with a clean-handed taste that made critics nod. He had the resources Evelyn would need and a dealmaker's appetite. He arrived at the Willow Crest porch with a briefcase, watch, and an appraisal book. I am interested, Tom said without flourish. Not as a personal salvo. As land, as opportunity. I can present a letter of intent contingent on title and permit clearance. If you want speed, we can structure an agreement with escrow and a conditional closing. That does not mean we beat the system. It means we align financing so that when permits are cleared, funds are available. I have relationships with lenders who will move quickly on a pre-approved demolition for development. His language was transactional. And yet it contained the particular warmth of men who love to see a site reborn. Tom did not promise miracles. He promised alignment. Evelyn listened. She measured the risk and the leverage. He could accelerate a sale when the technical conditions were met. The sale could, in turn, create momentum for a clear, legal demolition sequence. Every person she met, every document she collected, was a piece of a larger diagram. She sketched that diagram on graph paper and later, at night, on a legal pad. She traced dependencies like an architect tracing load lines. If the engineer's report indicated unsafe conditions, the city could grant an expedited permit for removal. If Tom's developer financing was aligned and held in escrow, the sale could proceed quickly upon clearance. If the title research upheld the company's ownership and the forged signatures showed a pattern of intent, Daniel's legal standing would shrink to a small, legally defensible claim. Still, she did not want to be blind to contingency. She kept an ethical margin in everything she considered. She did not seek vengeance as spectacle. She sought precision that would leave no accident for story. She had always believed that the worst errors came from hiding one's own mistakes in grandeur. Her strategy required time, and she used that time like one uses curing mortar, to harden and become useful. She scheduled a hazardous material survey, ordered a full structural assessment, and asked Claire to prepare the template for a petition that included both the civil claim and a criminal referral for the forged documents. Claire warned her of the friction that would come. There will be the court of public opinion while this moves slowly in the court of law, she said. People will choose sides. You will be painted. Prepare for it. Evelyn expected that. She had, after all, dismantled professional reputations before. She knew how quickly a narrative could be twisted on a headline. She decided to control disclosure. For the moment she would keep her actions private, a matter of records and sealed files. She would let the legal system unspool where it must, and she would move on the development pathway if the technical and legal criteria permitted. Family conversations were not uncomplicated. When she finally called Margaret, it was a conversation that exposed a different geometry of loyalty. Margaret had been at the wedding. Margaret's voice, when it arrived across the line, was defensive and small. I did not mean to hurt you, she said. It is complicated. Daniel says she sounded faint, rehearsed. Evelyn listened as if at a site meeting where two contractors argued over scope. You attended his wedding, she said finally, not loud, but with the authority of someone inspecting a compromised beam. You smiled in a photograph that excludes me. Margaret's silence was a thin crack. We thought, she said. Your father thought you thought, Evelyn repeated. Each repetition was a measure of weight. The words were not a sermon. They were an attempt to render the pattern evident. Margaret could not see the cracks under the surface. She had, like many people, sided with what she could best tile into the story of her life. Anna's reaction was different. When Evelyn asked, Anna insisted she did not know the details. She was careful and defensive, as if the house of familial affection were a fragile porcelain that might shatter under the weight of truth. Ethan cursed first and then retreated. Each family member responded in their own grammar of fear and self-preservation. None of them presented as a clear antagonist. None of them offered an ally. Evelyn felt the ache of it. She had not wanted to lose her family. She had wanted them to be a shelter, and instead they had become plumbing she had maintained alone. Some of her anger was practical. She had given money and time in counsel. Some of it was the private sting of being erased in a family photograph. But she did not let the ache turn into spectacle. She kept it as a fuel measured by the work she planned. Claire filed the petition within a week. The documents outline charges usual in divorce, abandonment and adultery, where applicable, and an extraordinary addition attempted fraud and forgery. The paper trail, Claire asserted, would be the spine of the case. She compiled the records and notarized the sequences of discovery. She instructed a process server to deliver the papers to Daniel at his office the next day at 9 in the morning. There was a cadence to the filing that was both terrifying and relieving. The act of filing a petition was like placing a compass point on a map. It created lines others could not unknow. Evelyn signed the documents with a hand that did not tremble. She felt the hum of the machine that would now begin to move. The conditional sale agreement Tom proposed was drafted in parallel. It was not a swift exchange of money for land. It was a structure, a letter of intent with contingencies, title validation, clearance on hazardous materials, and a developer timeline. The funds would sit in escrow. The buyer would have the right to close once permits were in order. Claire had allowed a clause to permit a tight transfer of development rights upon court acknowledgement that the house sat in a corporate asset under Evelyn's firm. This was not legerdemain. It was legal architecture. When the engineer's full report arrived, it carried the kind of dry, precise language that made a path possible. The report listed evidence of structural compromise, rot in the eastern sill, compromised tie beams, and a roof that had been patched but not reinforced. There were unpermitted changes noted in the attic that indicated structural shortcuts had been taken in earlier renovations. The report did not say tear down. It said, instead, that the house, if left without significant remediation, presented risks that would need mitigation. It recommended a course of removal that would be faster than a full renovation and safer given the current conditions. Claire's text came before midnight on the day she had begun the filing. It was short and framed with the economy of a woman who lived in files. We have subpoenaed 18 months of email headers and server logs. Be ready, she wrote. Evelyn read the message twice and then 3 times, as she had once read the photograph. The subpoena meant the bones of the scheme would be exposed, if the headers and logs matched the content of the emails she had in hand. It also meant that the process she had planned, technical, legal, methodical, was in motion. There would be hearings. There would be press. There would be public opinion that might not care for nuance. She turned the engineer's report over in her hands and then placed it carefully in the manila folder next to the declined loan applications. The folder was no longer a curiosity. It had become an armature. She was not a woman of spectacle. She was an architect reconciling a structure that had failed. That night she did not sleep. She sat at her drafting table and began to draw, slowly and deliberately, a site plan not only for a building but for what she would do with the life that had been dismantled. She sketched a series of small houses that would sit on the lot, units built with care for a small neighborhood that would honor the harbor and the light. She drew a plaza where children could run and where her office might sponsor a small scholarship for young architects. The act of drawing soothed her in a way that paperwork did not. It was an act of construction that had no malice in it. Claire had told her she would face choices that were not purely legal. There will be ethical questions no statute will answer, Claire had said. You will have to decide how you want to be seen. Evelyn had thought of that then as a distant problem. Now it sat like another layer laid into the plan. She was dismantling a thing that had been shared. She would be judged. Some would praise. Some would condemn, but there was one clarity that had hardened within her: she would operate within the bounds of the law. As she had learned in the dispassionate hours of title research and structural surveys. She would marshal evidence, follow procedure, and, if the law permitted, move forward. Days accelerated. The city's permitting office required documentation. The hazardous materials survey came back with asbestos elements in older insulation. This could slow demolition because abatement was required. Jack told her that abatement added time but not impossibility. Tom tightened his financing contingency to reflect the abatement schedule. Lenders shifted schedules accordingly. Claire fanned the flames of legal readiness. Drafting affidavits, lining up forensic analysts, and then, on a brisk morning that smelled of early winter, Claire called with a single sentence that made the air in Evelyn's lungs feel thinner. Our forensic team reports there are patterns in the headers that indicate a consistent path of communication from his work account to another address over the last 18 months, Claire said. It is not conclusive yet, but it is suggestive. The bank has produced copies of wire transfers that match certain hotel stays. We will have more after the server turnover. Be prepared for escalation. Something in Evelyn's face softened, not with mercy but with the cold clarity of confirmation. The world of rumor had folded into the world of evidence. Where rumor had been ragged and indefinite, evidence was precise and measurable. She felt the tilt of the universe right itself by a degree. When the process server delivered the petition at 9 o'clock the next morning, the service was as mundane and terrible as all legal formality. Daniel's assistant accepted the packet as if accepting a stack of files that had always existed. Daniel emerged, shirt slightly rumpled, as if the act of being served were merely a clerk's interruption. He read the envelope in stages. His mouth flexed. For a moment he seemed to consider the absurdity of the paper. Then his face, which had once looked familiar and small to her, tightened. He asked for a private word and then, with a tight voice he used when flustered professionals made mistakes, demanded to know how she had found the documents. Evelyn watched him without animus. Claire was with her, a presence like a balanced brace. She handed him the compact evidence folder, and it felt to her like the delivery of an instrument. He read and his face moved through the stages of comprehension, then fury. Then something that resembled shame. "You cannot do this," he said finally. Too thin with anger to be credible. Claire's reply was the kind of answer that grew from a life of procedure. "We can, and we will, if necessary," she said. "We have documents that will be presented. If you have explanation, make it to counsel." He sputtered and accused. Evelyn listened to the smallness of it. He threatened to countersue. She had expected this. She expected threats because threats were the currency of men who believed leverage was the world they could be. By noon there were emails from Daniel that were either bluster or an early attempt at constructing a defense. Claire filed responsive notices. The public preview had not yet happened, but the instruments of law had begun to play notes audible even to the city's indifferent everyday life. That night, alone at her drafting table, Evelyn examined the manila folder once more. She let herself think of what she would do should the instruments of law be slow. She considered the public fallout. She considered the moral questions Claire had raised. And she considered the engineer's report, with its recommendation that the site, as currently configured, presented measurable risk. Claire's last text that evening was simple. "Prepare," she wrote. "They will not go quietly." Evelyn closed her laptop and set the folder into a locked drawer. Her plan had become both smaller and larger, smaller in that the actions were rooted in evidence and procedure. Larger in that they touched not only the man who had betrayed her but the constellation of family, public perception, and professional reputation. She did not sleep that night. She drafted a short paragraph she had not intended to send to anyone. It was not a threat. It was not a boast. It described in thin, technical terms why she had made the choices she had. To preserve the integrity of what she had built and to remove the hazard that had been set in motion. In the morning the harbor light distilled into a thin silver line on the water, and the city breathed around her like a living plan. She stepped out and felt, for the first time since she had read that photograph, a steadiness in her joints that had nothing to do with the coolness of the blue monitor or the number of signatures on a deed. She felt a professional certainty shaped by knowledge and a personal decision carved by betrayal. The map she had drawn on paper now had points of validation. The engineer's report, the bank's records, the developer's contingent offer, and the legal filings all aligned to create a possible trajectory forward. It was not a guarantee. No structure ever offered that. It was, however, a plan with load-bearing calculations that could be proven, and as the day threaded on, the city's tide of movement allowed her to believe, for the first time since she had read the message, that she could convert the ruin into a foundation. The demolition across the street offered a quotidian lesson. When a building was taken down with precision, what remained was material ready to be used again. Her phone buzzed. Claire's message blinked on the screen. "We have subpoenaed 18 months of email headers and server logs. Be ready." Evelyn's chest tightened, not with fear, but with the quality of a hinge turning. She folded the engineer's report into a safe envelope and set it beside the manila folder. The folder carried the lead weight of everything she was unmaking. She breathed, steady and slow, and traced another line on her site plan. The pencil point steady and exact. Across the harbor, men in hard hats ate from brown paper bags and spoke of nails and beams. The city continued in its mechanical, remarkable indifference. Evelyn felt the edges of a new structure form around her life, legal, technical, moral. She had mapped the plan. Now the plan would be tested. The morning arrived as a thin, uncommitted thing. Night had not yet surrendered fully today. The harbor lay cool and quiet, and light, uncertain and narrow, threaded along the water as if testing a line. Evelyn sat in the driver's seat of her car with the engine off, watching the sight from across the street. The lot where Willow Crest had stood was a mound of flattened earth and the last, scattered timbers of a house she had once loved in principle. Heavy machinery waited in a patient line. Men moved with the purposeful slowness of people accustomed to dangerous tasks. She had told herself that she would not make this a spectacle. She had told herself that this would be lawful and precise. She had told herself that evidence and engineering would justify every step. All of those assertions were true. They did not, however, diminish the human dimensions of the morning, the smallness of the ordinary things that had become anything but ordinary. A child on a bicycle rode past and looked toward the site with a curiosity that was immediately replaced by something else when the child saw the trucks. An elderly neighbor stood at his porch, hands clasped. As if the activity were a visitation, Claire was at Evelyn's elbow with a folder of documents and a pencil in her hand as if she were noting final items on a ledger. Jack Thornton, the contractor, walked the perimeter with the calm of a man who had measured hundreds of walls that would not stand. Tom Hardy, the developer, moved among his own crew, hands tucked as if into pockets that had 1,000 contracts hidden there. Natalie arrived at dawn, alert but steady. They were a small company, each member playing a role in a plan that had been drawn to technical and legal tolerances. The pre-dawn was all small gestures that mattered. Claire confirming via a phone call that the city inspector had arrived and reviewed the paperwork. Jack checking the demolition plan and pointing at a diagram with a gloved finger. Tom reviewing the escrow release instructions with his financing officer. Natalie checking the camera placement to capture a clear record of chain of custody for debris and disposal. None of it was dramatic. It was legal and procedural, and precisely for that reason it felt like a moral armor. Evelyn let herself remember details of Daniel in an odd, associative cadence. She thought of the shy laughter that had once softened a holiday. She thought of the small, earnest way that he had once praised a granite selection. In rapid flashes, she mapped those tender recollections over the raw mechanics of the morning, an excavator arm swinging where a hand had once rested. A demolition plan where a family portrait had once hung. Memory and machine cut across each other. For a moment she expected dissonance, but instead she felt something close to neutrality, an engineer's calm in the face of a structural defect. The feelings were complicated and layered. As structures are when old and new materials meet, Jack briefed the crew near the mounted sign that listed the permit numbers, the hazardous materials report references, and the municipal contact. The city inspector stepped forward and checked signatures, then nodded. He deliberately spoke the words that would anchor their legal path: verification of permit, confirmation of documented hazardous materials abatement, confirmation that a third-party environmental contractor was present to monitor asbestos removal. That last item had nearly derailed their timetable, but the contractor had been retained. Abatement had been scheduled and completed to regulation, and a certificate of clearance had been filed with the city that morning. The checkboxes had been checked in the correct order. The demolition would proceed in stages, Jack explained to the men in a voice that was measured, the way a foreman speaks to his crew. They conducted the soft strip removing fixtures, specialized wiring, and potentially hazardous materials in a sequence meant to minimize sudden shifts in load. They mapped the house like a surgeon maps an organ. The crew removed elements in the precise pattern of a controlled unbuilding. Windows were removed and stacked. Interior walls were stripped to their studs. Plumbing and exposed conduits were bundled unlabeled. The demolition sequence was not a single dramatic action. It was a series of smaller sacrifices, each deliberate, each intended to limit collateral effects. Evelyn watched the choreography with the clinical appreciation of a person trained to see load and counterload. She found the sight unsentimental, almost beautiful in the geometry of purpose. Each cut was a line. Each collapsed wall was a line made visible. The excavator Jack's most trusted machine was a long arm that obeyed its operator like a limb obeys a practiced mind. There was a small hiccup. A neighbor, a woman who had lived on the block for decades, appeared at the temporary fence, her features a face of worry and grievance. "My wife is allergic to dust," she called over there. "They said they would protect us." A city inspector turned and promised to double the mitigation protocols: additional dust suppression, water misting, and an extra barrier. A man ran a hose along a sluice. The hiccup required an on-site notation, a signed addendum, and the reassurance of the abatement contractor who rerouted certain debris lines to avoid the neighbor's side. The hiccup was small and notable because it kept the event tethered to public process. Nothing about the morning was a secret, except the private architecture of motive in Evelyn's head. The process continued. As the crew moved to structural weakening, Jack explained the process to Evelyn in words meant to both inform and to keep her calm. They would remove interior load paths in a controlled fashion, not enough to cause a sudden failure but sufficient to allow mechanical devices to take a load down to a point where it could be safely folded away. They used hydraulic shears and a high-reach excavator. They had established a sequence of cuts designed to make the building collapse in on itself. A careful choreography that minimized fly rock and avoided transferring load unexpectedly to neighboring properties. The sound design of the morning was an orchestration of striking and settling. Metal against brick sparked. The hydraulic hammer's thump was like the measured pulse of labor. Dust rose and was captured by water fog and capped with sheeting. The machine operators spoke in the clipped language of radio signals. Safety hats bobbed like a slow, industrial tide. Evelyn listened to the sound and felt the trade-off between creation and removal. To build was to employ labor and care. To dismantle was the same. Within this technical ballet, there were small human islands of vulnerability. Natalie, positioned near the chain-link perimeter, recorded the process with a camera that would ensure there was an unambiguous record for court or public scrutiny. She looked up once at Evelyn and then away, as if the camera shielded them both from excessive intimacy. Tom moved among absent men with businesslike expressions that contained a trace of personal calculation. Jack supervised with his usual half-smile that was more a reflection of competence than affection. The cross-cutting with travel and celebration began quietly, at first a whisper that gathered volume. In a seamless montage threaded through the demolition, social media posts appeared and multiplied. Daniel uploaded a string of images from the yacht they had rented in Croatia, sunset photos, an image of Lila laughing with her head thrown back, an image of the family raising champagne glasses. Someone in the comments wrote something perfunctory like, "Congratulations." And the string of reactions swelled with hearts and clinking glass emojis, a digital applause for a life that had left one person behind. Evelyn watched these posts in real time. She had resisted the temptation to reply. She had no desire to enter the orbit of Daniel's curated life. She watched because information was a form of weather and she wanted to see how social gusts would blow. The posts, radiant and oblivious, arrived like parallel events from another time zone. They had nothing in common with the municipal permit numbers and the hazard abatement certificates that she followed in the physical world. That separation unsettled her slightly. It also steeled her resolve. The demolition proceeded into the controlled collapse stage. Jack called the final sequence and the crew followed the plan they had rehearsed. The centered suction of the high-reach excavator applied the last calculated removal. The beam that had borne the main ridge sagged and slackened. The wall gave way in a measured, deliberate shudder that left an inward folding rather than a catastrophic outward expulsion. Dust rose and then settled in the slow way dust does when the movement has been carefully choreographed. The house yielded. Evelyn felt nothing like triumphant glee. There was a numbing certainty that had replaced fury. The action succeeded in its technical aims, the debris fell within containment, the structure yielded inward, and there was no danger to the neighboring properties. 2 city inspectors nodded, and the abatement contractor signaled completion. A clearance certificate was filed. The lot remained a tidy, flattened plain of earth bordered by temporary fencing and measured tape. She had intended, from the early sketches she had drawn in the night, to be absent from the direct spectacle. She had wanted the legal instruments and the technical professionals to do what they must do. And yet she had remained across the street, parked like one sentry among the indifferent morning traffic. The act of watching had its own gravity.
While the crew packed their tools and prepared for debris removal the following day, the sequence of arrivals at Logan Airport commenced. Jetlays and immigration lines swallowed the family in a cascade of luggage and polished shoes. Social posts told part of the tale. Selfies from the terminal, a clip of the family stepping onto Boston soil with sunshine on their faces. Their shared narrative of a joyful vacation continued in the curated language of small cameras. The world they returned to was the same city, but a city whose immediate geography they had not inspected for the change that had been quietly engineered. Evelyn tracked their progress in the way one watches a slow tide. Her phone displayed the series of notifications as the family proceeded through customs and toward a fleet of waiting vehicles. She watched because she wanted the timing to fold as her plan anticipated. The conditional sale documents sat in escrow. The bank wire would be available once a nominal clearance passed. She had not expected a miracle in speed, but the alignment, title confirmed, hazardous materials abated, developer financing in place, had produced an unusually tight schedule. They arrived in 3 vehicles, the luxury SUVs gliding up the neighborhood with the careless confidence of people who assume the world will hold in their favor. Their footsteps on the sidewalk were easy and expectant. They carried shopping bags and souvenirs and the thick private glow of shared indulgence. They laughed. They took photographs of one another as if to guarantee the permanence of the day. They chatted about the food and the sale, the way the water smelled like something else entirely. They moved as if the world were designed to meet them where they were. When they turned onto the block, the first person to see the lot was Daniel. His hand tightened on a shopping bag. His mouth formed into a small, private smile that then dissolved when his eyes took the place where his sense of a home should have been. He stopped on the sidewalk as if the world had performed a trick he had not been told about. His face went through stages of comprehension as he took in the flattened plain bounded by orange temporary fencing and a modest bench that someone had installed on a whim near the curb. He looked at the bench, then at the sidewalk, then at the house numbers that still appointed the address. Margaret, wearing sunglasses and a dress that matched the lavender of the photograph, followed behind, and her own smile stiffened when she realized the configuration of the street had changed. Anna, the sister, scrolled her phone as if to find some clue in the digital world that might be true enough to explain the absent. Ethan stood with luggage at his feet and looked from car to lot, the expression of someone whose expectations had not measured this scale of emptiness. They approached the curb not as a family stepping to a civic misfortune, but as guests finding themselves the subject of a private puzzle. Their anticipatory smiles dissolved like salt in water. Daniel took 2 steps onto what he believed to be the lane to his own home, and then stopped entirely. He did not move forward. He did not speak. He looked at the empty space with the simple need of someone encountering a misarranged room. Evelyn had prepared for this. She had not intended to deliver the performance of a trap. She had intended an act of lawful clarity. But prepared or not, the moment of confrontation existed at the intersection of the private and the public. She stepped from her car and walked slowly across the curb until she was 6 feet from where they stood. The group turned. Margaret saw her first, and then everyone else focused on the figure Evelyn had become, deliberate in her black coat, hair tucked back, hands empty but for a small phone clenched as if it were a business instrument. "Good afternoon," Evelyn said, in a voice that was calm and clear. Her words were measured as if she were walking someone through a set of plans. "How was your trip?" Daniel stammered for a moment, as if searching for a script. "Evelyn," he said, and it was the name of a man who had not finished learning the grammar of apology. "What?" "You saw the picture. You sent the picture." Evelyn disassociated the event from any personal fragility. The legal folder she had brought now sat on the hood of a neighbor's parked car, visible as if laid out on a drafting table. She stepped toward it and opened the folder so that the scanned documents and the bank printouts fluttered briefly in the light. She did not brandish them. She did not shout. She made no accusation in an intemperate voice. She presented. Then she played the audio. Her phone had been prepared in advance. She had not planned this as vulgar exposure. It was a factual step in the process. The voice came out of the small speaker, tentative and clear. Daniel's voice said, calm, eager, "Once I get the money from the house, we can leave sooner. She will never know until it is too late." There was laughter that followed, bright and careless. The recording had the small reverb of an interior office and the intonation of people who believed themselves secure from consequence. The sound reached the curb like a blade snagged gently. For a beat, no bird sang. The family's faces rendered into an anatomy of shock. Margaret's sunglasses fell away from the shield of habituated calm. Anna's phone slipped from her fingers as if startled. Ethan's hands clenched. Daniel's face turned slowly through a dozen shades, first red, then ash, then the ashen slack of comprehension. Claire stood a respectable distance away with an air of courthouse proceduralism. Natalie kept the camera rolling, capturing the moment the family collided with a reality they had never reckoned at full scale. Tom remained slightly to the background, his business face unreadable, but his eyes calculating. Daniel lunged for the phone with a reflex that had less to do with the recording than with the need to deny. He cried out that the recording was selective, out of context, edited. He asked how Evelyn had gotten access to work email. He accused. Each accusation was an attempt to construct a narrative in which he could remain central and authoritative. Evelyn listened. She had expected the sound of denial. She had expected the flurries of a man who sought to turn other people into witnesses for his own story. Claire moved with the authority of counsel when people attempt to deflect. "We have subpoenaed records. We will present them in the appropriate venue. For now, the documents are here and will be added to the record as needed." There were the first murmurs from neighbors, a spreading of curiosity into judgment. A woman with a child in a stroller had stopped by the curb and was now choosing a side or none. The phones recorded everything: the scene, the faces, the small details that would later accrete into social narrative. For anyone watching from a distance, the tableau was stark. A flat lot, a small bench, a woman who had been wronged standing in legal calm, and a family whose photograph had become the evidence of a betrayal. Daniel's knees gave out. The world had a structural failure, and his body experienced the failure in a pure physical way. He sank down to the curb as if stunned. He sat with his head in his hands. Clara, who had been a portrait of vacation brightness minutes ago, now stood with the thin thread of a new comprehension coiling across her features. She reached for his arm and then withdrew her hand as if uncertain whether she could touch what had been undone by the day. Margaret began to speak, then stopped, words dissolving. She moved closer to Daniel and tried to find him in ways that had once been available. An expression, a touch, a pleading. Her voice became a wail of accusation and confusion. Anna wept openly, and then tried to compose herself, scolding her tears as if they were private inelegances. Ethan paced and then sank near Daniel's side, the family now arranged in the geometry of disturbance. Evelyn watched the scene hold like a shuttered photograph until the mechanics of the morning resumed. The demolition crew packed up and the neighbors returned to their porches, some with sympathy and some with judgment. The recording had been a pivot. It had produced a moment in which private intent became public evidence. There was no physical violence. There did not need to be. The impact was delivered with precision that had the shape of a well-placed structural hand. The high drama was not over. There would be hearings and investigations and the long public argument that draws its breath from legal minutiae. But the immediate shock sat in the air, a palpable thing. Evelyn did not feel triumphant in a cartoon sense. The edges of the moment were quieter than she had imagined, less a scream than a long, measured exhale. She had removed the thing that had allowed them to return to life as if nothing had changed. She had done so by process and by precision.
As she stepped back toward her car, a neighbor called out with a voice both curious and accusatory. "You destroyed a home," the neighbor said. "How can you live with this?" Evelyn did not answer with condemnation or defense. She stood for a long second and then said, with a fairness that was not offered often by people in the act of anarchy, "I built it, and I paid for it. That is the paper. The papers are the foundation for what we do here." Her voice carried a truth that was not meant to be comforting. It was a statement of fact. She walked away then, toward the car, leaving behind a scene that would be dissected and debated. She had orchestrated a legal, safe, controlled unbuilding of something that had been both structure and symbol. She had exposed a plan designed to extract value at the cost of trust. The family stood on the sidewalk and watched as a life changed its topography. For a moment, their faces were all the angles of human astonishment. Evelyn slid into the driver's seat with hands that felt oddly light. The engineer's report was folded in her bag. Claire had placed copies of the bank statements in a secure file. Natalie closed the camera and handed a drive to Claire. Tom had his phone full of notes. Jack loaded his last crate into a truck and then paused, wiping his hands, and then climbed into his cab. The machines left with the slow dignity of tools that had performed their function. When she drove away, the empty lot glowed like a new field. She had not sought vindication, nor had she sought vengeance in the simplistic sense. She had sought a lawful, measured solution. The street receded behind, and the family remained under the transient sky, a group suddenly instructed by consequence to ask themselves what had structure and what had been merely a facade. Evelyn did not celebrate. She drove to a small coffee shop and sat alone, feeling the residue of the morning settle in her chest, like a small, resolute stone. The recording, the documents, the cleared hazard reports, the escrow, they had produced a moment of undeniable exposure, but she felt an ache that the scene could not remedy. The excavation of a life had consequences for the person who had once loved and now had unmade a part of history. Her phone buzzed with messages and then with silence. The city continued to breathe and to move. The harbor reflected a hesitant sun. She placed her hands on the table and felt the grain of wood. For a long time, she did nothing but watch the cups of other customers and listen to the low murmur of voices. Inside her was a precise settlement of choices and consequences. The day had been executed, the house had been unbuilt in the controlled choreography she had arranged. The family had been confronted. The recording had been heard in the open. The legal machine had been engaged. The architecture of consequence had begun to assert itself. Yet the future remained unpaved. There would be hearings and countersuits and the slow, forensic airing of messages and records. The town would talk and the newspapers would ask their questions. Her father would shift into some new posture of support or distance. Her mother would gather herself into defenses. The family lines would be drawn in manners that time might not erase. Evelyn left the coffee shop when the light became slightly more sure. She walked to her car and found a stray message in her voicemail. It was short and raw. Her father's voice quavered. "I do not know how to be here," he said, "but I will be." She listened and then sat, breathing a steady, attentive breath, feeling the odd paradox of closure and the hollow that remained. She had executed the plan with the precision she had promised herself. She had watched a life pass into a new diagram. She had not sought spectacle, she had sought proper measures. The lot where Willowcrest had stood was clean and prepared for what might come. For the first time since the message, she felt a small permission to be tired. She let herself think about the new houses she had sketched and about the scholarship she might endow. She thought about mentoring a new generation of architects and about a young designer she had asked to join Shaw & Company, someone who reminded her of the architect she had once been, eager, uncompromised, hungry for the chance to build. She allowed herself a brief, private longing for the soft domestic scenes that existed now only in memory. As dusk settled, she parked and walked a block to the water where the harbor breathed in the cooling air. She stood a long time looking at the city she had helped to shape, at towers she had drawn and defended, and at the small plot of earth she had just reshaped. The controlled demolition had been an act of finality in one register and of potential in another. The space that remained was an invitation and a reminder. She did not know in that dim light which cost would anchor her in years to come. She did not know whether public opinion would deem her right or wrong. She felt only the fact that she had chosen, carefully and within the law, to alter the geometry of her life. The cost of choosing would arrive in many forms. She walked home beneath the hush of evening, each step a measured echo. The telephone calls would come. The suits would be filed. The small scaffolding of legal argument would arise like a new edifice meant to withstand scrutiny. For now, the lot rested like an obedient blank. For now, she had finished one stage. There would be more to do. There would be other reckonings. The morning was precise. The afternoon delivered the moment of public exposure. The night promised the slow work of consequence. She put a hand in her pocket and felt the manila folder, the papers inside, the signature lines that would come to matter. She inhaled and let herself rest on a small but hard truth. She had acted, and the world had changed because of it. At the edge of that change, the family remained on the sidewalk in a line that looked temporarily broken and exposed. Daniel sat on the curb, as if stunned by a structural failure he had not noticed until it was literal. The recording had been a small miracle of evidence. The media and the legal system would fold that afternoon into hearings and filings. For now, it was only dawn and dust and a woman who had, with the tools of law and engineering, performed a controlled unbuilding. She thought of the next day, of the debris removal and the leveling of the lot, of surveys and title transfers, and of the slow, stubborn work of rebuilding. The cameras were quiet for a while. The street chose to sleep. Evelyn let the tiredness come and sat briefly in the quiet, letting exhaustion and a small, unwavering certainty wash over her. She had executed her plan. A knot of consequences lay ahead, and she knew that their shape would be revealed slowly, in hearings and in quiet conversations. She would face public judgment. She would face the private ache of the life she had unmade. She had not sought to be cruel. She had sought to be correct, to move within the instruments of the law and the exactness of engineering. That was the architecture of her decision. When she finally rose and walked through the door of her apartment, the house felt like a building she had once drawn. It had an exposed plan and a new future to be imagined. She placed the manila folder in a locked drawer and lay down, knowing that sleep would be uneasy but certain. The day had been executed. The controlled unbuilding had been completed. The reveal had landed. Outside, the harbor reflected a sliver of moon. The lot waited. The quiet had the heavy weight of what had been accomplished. Evelyn could not yet know whether she had saved herself or broken a possibility that might have been redeemed in other ways. She only knew that she had drawn a new plan and had followed through with the care she always applied to creation. The rest would follow in its appointed time. The story that had been private became, with the speed of a public machine, a conversation not entirely of Evelyn's making. The morning after the demolition, the sidewalk carried small storms. Neighbors lingered on porches and spoke in cautious threads. Someone had filmed the confrontation and uploaded the clip. The footage moved from phone to phone, then from feed to feed, until it landed in the newsrooms that lived off the currency of the sensational. Within hours, a small circle of local reporters had placed vans at the corner beneath Willowcrest's former address. A camera on a tripod turned its black eye toward an empty lot and the woman who had been the architect of the moment.
Evelyn watched the unfolding of public narrative with the precise dispassion that had guided her through blueprints. She had anticipated scrutiny. She had not underestimated the velocity of judgment. Still, reality arrived in ways that were neither wholly new nor entirely expected. Messages filled her phone. Some were brief notes of support from colleagues and former clients. Others were venomous accusations from people who had seen only a photograph and concluded an animus. There were calls from journalists who wanted sound bites and queries from legal bloggers who wanted to know whether a demolition could be executed under the conditions she described. Margaret's voice came through the noise in a way that felt loudly intimate. She had posted a public comment on one of the shared pictures that called Evelyn's actions selfish and cruel. The comment read like a small indictment. "Family comes first," she had written. Evelyn read it and felt an old ache that had once been smooth as plaster give in to a hairline crack. The comment was not merely public, it was personal. Other relatives joined the thread, and the conversation turned into a small tribunal of family and strangers. Her father's message stood apart. George's text was quiet, almost shy, a handful of sentences that did not demand absolution. He wrote he did not know what had been happening in their marriage, and that he was sorry he had not seen her loneliness sooner. He wrote that he was proud of her and that he would be there when she wanted him. Evelyn read the message twice and did not reply immediately. There were other messages she blocked, as if containing small shards of accusation she did not wish to save. Media vans framed a tableau of a city that consumed stories. The reporters wanted the tidy lines of a drama. They wanted the cut and thrust of a moral argument. They wanted an angry victim or a vengeful villain. Reality refused to be reductive. Evelyn was both wronged and a woman who had made a decisive, irrevocable choice. The world around her demanded a label, and the law offered procedures rather than slogans. The legal response arrived not as rumor, but as paper. Daniel's counsel was thin-lipped and quick to move. He filed a motion in Superior Court for a temporary restraining order and an emergency injunction seeking the return of assets and asking for a temporary freeze on escrow funds. The motion alleged that Evelyn had committed a fraudulent conveyance by disposing of what he framed as marital property without full notice or mutual consent. He argued that until a court could investigate, assets should remain untouched. Claire read the motion at her desk with a slow, steady gaze. She had expected resistance. She had not expected the fierce speed with which Daniel's attorneys would pursue an ex parte remedy. The ex parte petition carried with it a dangerous urgency. If a judge believed that assets had been wrongfully diverted, an immediate freeze could place Evelyn's carefully arranged financing into stasis. The developer's contingent closings and Tom's financing could be delayed, causing cascading complications. "Motion for a temporary restraining order," Claire said aloud, as if stating a formula. She pointed to the lines on the pleading that contended fraud and wrongful destruction. They are asking for immediate relief, arguing irreparable harm. Evelyn considered the phrase irreparable harm. It had a certain theatricality. It also had teeth. If the judge entertained the argument long enough to freeze escrow, Tom's financing would be held in limbo pending the hearing. If that happened, the carefully prepared pathway for the lot to clear for development would stall. It was a material risk. It was also a test of whether meticulous preparation and a robust evidentiary file could outpace legal theatrics. Claire moved to assemble response. She filed a memorandum contesting the facts and attaching the chain of title, the postnuptial agreement, the engineer's report, the hazardous materials clearance, the escrow agreements, and the recorded bank statements that proved the source of funds and the absence of Daniel's contribution to the house's mortgage. She included the forensic analyst's preliminary report that identified patterns in email headers and IP addresses connecting Daniel to exchanges with Leela that suggested intent to appropriate equity. She framed the demolition as a legal exercise grounded in public safety and corporate governance. She also subpoenaed further documents, issuing formal requests for Daniel's employment email header logs, records from the bank regarding the declined loan applications, and the cell phone records that could corroborate audio metadata. The legal machinery turned with the noise of evidence being assembled. Each subpoena was a spin of the instrument that sought to reveal more of the sequence that had led to demolition. At the same time, Claire issued a demand for discovery from Leela's counsel, requesting bank statements, the prenuptial agreement that had been announced at the wedding, and other documents that might reveal financial arrangements. Claire's team found wire transfers from Leela's personal account to Daniel's account over the previous year. The pattern was startling.
Dollars marched in an organized file. They were small enough to be plausibly gifts, and large enough to suggest a financial relationship that required explanation. A twist arrived in the form of Clara's prenup. Leela's counsel submitted a court-stamped copy showing that she had executed a comprehensive prenuptial agreement with her father's counsel present before the marriage. The agreement insulated her trust and sources of family wealth from any spousal claims. Claire read the document and considered the legal consequence. If Leela had protected her assets, then the funds flowing to Daniel complicated rather than simplified the story. They suggested not that Daniel had married into wealth that would help him, but rather that he had attempted to secure equity from Leela to finance his exit. The money he had received from Leela might be part of this messy compensation, yet the prenuptial itself made it less likely that Daniel could profit from Leela's assets in a way that would render Evelyn's act of demolition a frivolous interference with a plan. Claire prepared to argue precisely that point. Motive that does not equate to legal claim. Motive might explain behavior, but it did not validate property rights. The legal contest was not solely about moral fault. It was about what the statutes and the deeds said. Meanwhile, the family unraveled in private ways that were not always visible in the public record. Margaret retreated into a defense that had deeper roots than the photograph. In small private flashbacks, the narrative opened onto a life in which Margaret had been a woman shaped by scarcity and by a pattern of measuring success by closeness to a stable man. She had been raised in a household where appearances mattered, even when the foundation was weak. In Margaret's memory, the presence of a family unit, children, and a son-in-law with status had signified a rescue from the anxieties that had stalked her. Daniel's charm offered her a way to imagine security. She did not imagine malice when she donned a lavender dress and stepped before the camera in Croatia. She imagined the image of family. That image, when spliced into real time by Evelyn's actions, felt to her like a betrayal of something she had mistakenly believed to be precious. Natalie discovered that the threads of familial complicity carried human costs. She called Anna in the days after the demolition, and the call unraveled into a raw exchange. Anna had felt the old habit of placation as a survival skill. She had been the easier child to shepherd because she yielded to the family's expectations. On the phone, she confessed that she had not realized the depth of the deception. She had not seen the emails, and she had not considered that Daniel might be extracting value from a life that was not fully shared. Her voice broke, and she offered apologies that were both sincere and inadequate. Ethan, who had taken loans and occasionally leaned on Evelyn's quiet generosity, sat with a great load of guilt that the public could not fully witness. He had accepted help as if it were a right, rather than a gift. The demolition forced him to see his indebtedness in a new light. In a scene both intimate and small, Evelyn met him at a diner late one night. He was honest. He told her he had been resentful and grateful in turns, and that he had allowed the family unity to be described in ways that had excluded her pain. He admitted that he had not once considered by what margin she had sustained them. His apology was not a cure. It was, however, an opening. She accepted it with the cool kindness she often reserved for professional colleagues. She did not forgive everything. She did not push him away, either. The humanization of Margaret, Anna, and Ethan complicated the moral ledger in the public conversation. Viewers who had watched the clip online began to split into camps. Some lauded Evelyn as a woman who would not be used. Others depicted her as callous. The media could not decide whether to place her under the banner of empowerment or criminality. It chose both at times, because controversy feeds airwaves.
Evelyn's private life entered a strange twilight. The victory of exposure that had been its own kind of closure left a hollow within her like an architectural void. The morning's decisive action had not stitched the wound, it had simply revealed the bared edges. She slept fitfully for the first week after the demolition, waking to dreams of rooms populated by ghost versions of conversations she had once had. In those dreams, the house stood as it had at various stages of their marriage.
in early light as a place that promised future children, in afternoon shadow as an office where Daniel sat with his laptop, in winter dusk as a place where she had cooked and set plates. The dreams left her with a strange double vision, the place as both built memory and absent lot. Natalie, perceptive in ways that blended friendship and professional concern, suggested therapy. "Not because you are broken," she said, "because you are human, and this is heavy." Evelyn resisted at first. She had been trained to process difficulty in plans. She found the idea of talking about feelings oddly foreign. And yet the nights and the empty counter that had once held the mundane traces of a shared life suggested that some processing was necessary. At a small office where a therapist with an unremarkable name kept tidy files, Evelyn spoke in a voice modulated by practice and tension. She recited facts: the postnuptial agreement, the title, the engineer's report, the bank statements showing deposits, and the forensic analyst's initial timeline. The therapist listened and then asked what the demolition had cost her besides the house. She tried to find that answer and found instead a list of small losses: the warmth of an old habit, the sense that someone had stood with her to hold the lines, the possibility that her father might fracture across the seam of loyalty. She admitted to a feeling she had not named clearly until that session, that the act had left a small emptiness at the center of her day. A public hearing loomed. Daniel's attorneys pushed for injunctive relief. They argued that the demolition represented an attempt to render the property beyond remedy and that immediate provisional measures were required. They demanded that the court place a temporary restraint on the transfer of funds from escrow and that all parties be enjoined from disposing of assets until discovery concluded. Claire prepared to counter with detailed evidence. She filed opposition papers and did not rely only on technical documents. She included affidavits from Jack and the abatement contractor, from the engineer, and from the city inspector who had signed off on the hazard clearance. She framed the demolition as not a capricious act of malice, but a corporate governance action consistent with the LLC's prerogatives. She argued that the title rested in the company coffers, that Daniel's claim to ownership lacked foundation because he had contributed no capital, and that the alleged forgery would, if proven, undercut any argument of equitable ownership. At the same time, an entirely different form of pressure arrived from Clara's father. Richard Ashford was a man whose business footprint threaded across multiple states. His counsel contacted Claire with the tone of a man prepared to make calculation rather than heat. They threatened to countersuit not only for reputational harm, but for alleged misrepresentation and the claim that Evelyn had intentionally orchestrated a scheme to lure Lila into a false marriage that would be used to extract assets. The claim was absurd when measured against the evidence Claire had amassed. Nevertheless, the threat carried practical consequences. Richard Ashford's team commanded resources and public influence. His firm had a capacity to mount a broad and expensive campaign that would complicate litigation and public perception. Richard's lawyers sent their letter formally and with the cool voice of men who believed in leverage. They demanded negotiations and threatened to raise questions about the way evidence had been obtained, the invasion of digital privacy, and any missteps in chain of custody that might be alleged. Their move was not necessarily a declaration of certainty. It was a stage strategy. The presence of a high-powered council created new vectors of time and cost. It injected a political economy into the legal dispute that Claire had not fully anticipated. Claire responded on the ground she had chosen: facts and procedure. She wrote to the court explaining that investigatory subpoenas had been issued and that she did not intend to play for public drama. The correspondence landed as a complex weave of professional argument. The push and pull of legal chess tiles moved in the days leading to the emergency hearing. Then Daniel's counsel filed an ex parte emergency motion asking the court to issue a temporary restraining order under the claim of irreparable harm and to freeze the escrowed funds pending adjudication. The ex parte nature of the petition attempted to short-circuit notice and compel immediate judicial review. The judge, who had a calendar stacked with similar domestic disputes and property fights, nevertheless recognized the procedural gravity of an ex parte petition.
He scheduled an emergency hearing to be held within 72 hours. Claire explained the implications to Evelyn in a meeting that felt like the quiet before the judge's gavel. If the judge issues a temporary freeze, Tom's financing will be put on hold until the court can sort the equities. That might delay closing. It might also cause lenders to re-evaluate their position. Evelyn absorbed the risk with a new kind of clarity. The plan she had drawn had been tight, but it had not been immune to the procedural levers that other people could pull. She had predicted resistance, but anticipation was not the same as protection. The emergency hearing introduced uncertainty. It introduced the possibility that the careful scaffolding of evidence might be unearthed in a public forum that favored sound bites and summary judgments. She went to the water that evening and watched the harbor lights. The city had a way of seeming to hold its breath before a storm. She felt the pressure of the coming days like weight on her back. She had created a structure for a possible future and had enforced the law to reveal wrongdoing. She had not, however, designed the shape of the cultural conversation that would follow. That life was not hers to dictate entirely. Across town, the Ashford law firm prepared counterpoints that would be ready in case the court allowed broad discovery into Lila's finances. They drafted a privacy defense and a claim for harassing exposure. Daniel's counsel pushed for evidentiary presumptions that would favor an immediate restraining order. The judge ordered the hearing, gave both sides time to brief, and set a schedule so compressed that it would force lawyers to find their best evidence quickly. Evelyn sat at her drafting table and opened the manila folder that now felt heavier than any one document could justify. Within its pages were the annotated loans and the declined notices, the engineer's report, a copy of the postnuptial agreement, the bank statements showing deposits, and the forensic analyst's initial metadata. Claire had emphasized the need for a layered approach: legal facts, technical facts, and narrative of motive. Each layer relied on another. In the days before the hearing, the city continued its ordinary life. Neighbors argued in small ways. The media continued to ask for statements. Evelyn's firm received emails from old clients with cautious condolences. Her father stopped by on a Saturday and sat at the kitchen table for an hour. He did not ask to revisit the events. He simply spoke of the house as if it were a life that had been eroded. "I wanted to be better," he said simply. "I did not see your loneliness." He did not ask for absolution. He asked only for a chance to inhabit the space that had been left. Evelyn permitted a small opening for that renewal. She did not claim her father's affection as payment for the demolition. She recognized his tardy insight as a beginning and not the end. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom filled with an air of quiet urgency. People sat in the gallery, members of the public, a few reporters, and a small cluster of neighbors who had an appetite for the slow revelation of private dispute. The judge arrived with the methodical calm that comes from years of adjudicating disputes. He read the filings and asked pointed procedural questions. The ex parte motion carried the initial advantage of surprise. Daniel's counsel emphasized immediacy and the risk of prejudicial loss. Claire rose and presented the counter-argument with a voice honed by lessons in temperament and evidence. She filed into the record the engineer's report, the hazardous material certificate, the escrow instructions, the chain of title, and the forensic analyst's initial timeline. She argued that the demolition had been a legal exercise performed under a corporate title, and that any claim of fraudulent conveyance required a showing of actual intent to hinder or fraud, which she argued the forensic material tended to prove the contrary. She asked the court to deny the injunction and to allow discovery to proceed in the normal course.
The judge listened. He acknowledged the competing equities. He noted that the evidence, as presented, required further testing, and that the court was loath to issue an order that would freeze funds where the demonstrable risk was not yet clear. He also noted the public interest in preventing the intentional destruction of potentially recoverable assets. He set a narrow path. The court would deny the request for a full freeze on escrow at that moment, but would grant a limited protective order requiring that certain disbursements be postponed until partial discovery had been completed. He ordered an expedited schedule for discovery and set a further hearing in 14 days. The ruling had the rough balance of a judge attempting to shepherd multiple legal interests. It was neither total vindication nor total defeat. It was a forced truce that left the litigation open and time compressed. The judge also ordered that the parties agree to a narrow protective protocol governing debris and disposal records. He required chain of custody documentation for all items removed from the lot. The partial victory did little to end the social storm. The Ashford Council, though constrained from raising a full injunction, launched a different front. They sent a letter to major media outlets claiming that their clients' privacy had been invaded and that certain evidence may have been acquired improperly. The claim implied that there might be grounds to challenge the admissibility of certain material in the event of criminal referral. It was a legal gambit that shifted focus from ownership to process, and it required Claire's team to re-examine chain of custody and the precise manner in which recordings and digital data had been obtained. Evelyn felt the result of the hearing in a slow way. She had avoided a catastrophic freeze, but she had been left with a compressed calendar and a new set of legal priorities. The judge's order obliged the parties to participate in a limited discovery that would begin immediately. The momentum in the litigation now favored thoroughness, but also injected a relentless cadence in which time bore as much weight as evidence. That night, Evelyn did not celebrate. She walked a narrow course between tired certainty and a more vulnerable recognition of the costs. She realized that the legal theater had become a mirror of the moral conflict she had initiated. The threads of family would not be quickly mended. The professional consequences continued to hover. She had acted for reasons she believed to be just. She had also chosen a path that would require her to live in a future shaped by those actions. As she lay awake, she thought of the small structure she had imagined on the lot, houses with light and careful public squares. She thought of the community scholarship she had promised under her breath to consider. She thought of the kind of woman she might become if she allowed herself to be taught again by failure. The consequences had arrived not just as legal papers, but as invitations to examine who she had been and who she would be. In the morning, the Ashford firm released a statement that would be picked up by larger outlets. It suggested that the matter contained elements of a personal vendetta and implied the possibility of privacy violations. The words had the faintly surgical tone of counsel who believed in the power of reputational leverage. Public debate flared anew. Commentators asked whether Evelyn's actions were just or whether they signaled a dangerous turn toward personal retribution being dressed as corporate governance. Evelyn continued to meet with Claire. They prepared evidence boxes and outlined depositions. They checked metadata and lined up an IT forensic expert who could verify the authenticity and the chain of custody of the files. They scheduled the forensic deposition of Daniel's email servers and requested logs showing IP addresses and timestamps. They subpoenaed the records for the wire transfers from Leela to Daniel and asked for a detailed accounting of where the funds went and on what dates. In one of the quieter hours, Natalie came by the office with a mug of tea and an offer of companionship. "This will not be over quickly," she said, "but you are not alone." Evelyn accepted the mug and the company. She let herself receive the small kindness. She had executed a plan and had confronted those who had betrayed her. The legal and social worlds had reacted in ways that were messy and imperfect. The cost would be counted by depositions and by nights spent awake. The court-ordered pace had become a new rhythm in which she would make her case and defend her choice. The judge's order setting the hearing within 72 hours and the subsequent calendar had created a legal cliff. The emergency motion had been partially denied, but the judge's narrow discovery schedule ensured that the pace was relentless. Claire's team worked feverishly to secure digital forensics and to verify the chain of custody for the evidence that had moved the morning of the demolition into the public record. It would be their task to make evidence speak clearly without the stain of impropriety. At the edge of the week, news of depositions and counsel letters reached the harbor like the slow pulse of tide. The city continued to move. The lot slept. Evelyn felt the shape of a new battle defined not by engineering alone, but by meticulous evidentiary warfare. She had opened a door that could not be shut easily. The consequences were vivid and many. She had not expected sympathy. She had not expected tranquility. She had expected the law to run its course and had believed that truth would vindicate her. Now, she had the stark sensation that truth required much work to be received. The legal process would test the authenticity of each file and each claim, and the human reckonings would continue to unfold in ways that might not be tidy. The final note of the week came in a document that landed with a small, formal weight.
Richard Ashford's counsel filed notice of potential counterclaims for defamation and invasion of privacy, and they suggested that the court might need to consider sanctions if the evidence had been improperly obtained. The notice was a formal weapon. It did not signify guilt or innocence. It signified that one more powerful actor had entered the dispute with resources for a prolonged campaign. Claire took the notice with the cold patience of someone prepared for this possibility. She began to draft defensive pleadings and to prepare for a battle that would examine not only motive and title, but also the process by which evidence had been gathered. That second front complicated the litigation. It raised the risk that crucial evidence might be excluded if chain of custody were flawed. Evelyn read the filings and felt for a breath the vertigo of the legal terrain. The judge's emergency hearing had narrowed one immediate danger, but another had unfolded. The presence of the Ashford counsel meant resources and a willingness to contest both the substance and the process. She sat alone with the manila folder that had begun as a curiosity and had evolved into the nucleus of a legal collision. She touched the edges of papers that had once only documented money and signatures. The documents now represented a life unmade and a legal structure that sought to test whether she had acted within the law. Outside, the city hummed contentiously. Inside, her life had been rearranged by actions that she had chosen for reasons she still believed were just. She had removed an unsafe structure and had not sought to hide the process from the eyes of the law. Yet the law had turned on her with its own instruments, and the instruments required that every piece of evidence be accountable. The cliffhanger arrived not as theatrical thunder, but as a short, precise court order handed down at the close of the first week after the demolition. The judge ordered expedited discovery and a further emergency hearing in 3 days to determine whether additional protective measures should be implemented. He required an immediate forensic verification of chain of custody for digital files used in the confrontation and asked both parties to present affidavits demonstrating that their evidence had been lawfully obtained. The schedule compressed into an urgent shape. The judge's order meant that Claire and Evelyn had to produce secure evidence and verification at a pace that would test the limits of their preparation. It also meant that the public drama would accelerate. The Ashford counsel's threat of a countersuit now carried an immediacy that could freeze financing or subject key evidence to challenge. Evelyn felt the floor of her life rise with the weight of the coming days. The structure she had executed with measured care now stood at the brink of legal scrutiny that might, in technicalities, unsettle its foundations. She breathed in the cold harbor air and filed the court order in the manila folder. The papers now had a temporal deadline. They were no longer only records of past actions. They were tasks due in the imminent future. Her work would be to show that the demolition was a lawful, evidence-based action, and that any allegations of impropriety were unfounded. The stakes have increased. The judge's calendar had given the litigation the urgency of a closing tide. She closed the folder and walked back to her car. The city had not stopped for the drama she had made. It moved on in shops and restaurants and in the quiet of laundry rooms. The lot where the house had been lay ready like a blank page. For the first time since she had read the message that had begun it all, Evelyn understood the full measure of what she had done. The law would decide many things. The human consequences would remain for longer.
The emergency hearing was scheduled in 72 hours. The world around her tightened into the shape of that deadline. She put her hands into her coat pockets and felt the manila folder's edge like a small, reassuring weight. Then she walked into the evening, knowing the days ahead would test evidence, character, and the brittle architecture of loyalty. The courthouse stood like a patient monument beneath a gray morning sky. Its limestone facade held the memory of countless reckonings. Inside, the air trembled faintly with the murmurs of lawyers, clerks, and the soft shuffle of papers, the prelude to another day of measured conflict. Evelyn Shaw sat at the long counsel table beside Claire Morales, her back straight, her hands folded neatly, her eyes steady on the grain of the wood. Across from her, Daniel and his legal team occupied their corner like actors who had rehearsed too much and believed the world owed them an audience. Between them stretched. The emergency hearing began at 9 o'clock. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s with clear eyes and a voice that bore neither warmth nor cruelty.
She asked for the parties to identify themselves. The formality of names and titles gave the moment an eerie stillness. Here, Evelyn was not wife, not victim, not avenger. She was petitioner. Daniel was respondent. The language cleansed emotion from meaning. Claire rose first. Her presence carried the calm ferocity of someone who knew the geometry of law. She laid out the case with measured cadence. The forged loan applications, the digital evidence verified by metadata, the emails connecting Daniel's work address to personal correspondence that discussed extracting funds, and the wire transfers traced to Leela Carter's accounts. Each item was marked, entered, and explained. Then she called the forensic handwriting expert. A man with rimmed glasses and the stillness of a surgeon took the stand. He explained the signatures, the way pressure patterns betrayed forgery, the inconsistent slant of letters, the absence of micro-oscillation that accompanies natural writing. On the overhead screen, a projection showed Daniel's authentic signature beside the forged one. The contrast was undeniable. Daniel's counsel objected. Tone strained, argument thin. He attempted to cast doubt on the chain of custody. Claire responded by producing notarized affidavits and digital chain of hash verifications. The forensic IT specialist stepped forward next, testifying how the original files had been extracted and timestamped. The metadata aligned perfectly with Daniel's personal laptop and his work server's remote login history. When Daniel was asked to take the stand, he hesitated. His lawyer whispered. He stood. The oath bound him. He spoke softly at first, painting himself as a man cornered by circumstance. He claimed the forged applications were a misunderstanding, that he had merely prepared drafts, that the signatures were part of a test submission. But when confronted with the voice recording, his own, light and eager, talking of leaving soon after getting money from the house, his explanations withered. His eyes darted toward Leela, seated 3 rows back, her face drained of all the bright confidence that had once defined her. The courtroom's silence thickened. The judge leaned forward, pen motionless above her notes. Leela was called next, reluctantly. Claire questioned her gently. Leela admitted to the wire transfers. They were, she said, loans. She claimed she had believed Daniel's assurances that the house was legally his as much as Evelyn's. When Claire asked whether she knew about the marriage certificate between Daniel and Evelyn still being valid during those transfers, Leela's composure cracked. She whispered, "He told me it was all finished. He said the divorce was already signed." Her father, Richard Ashford, sat rigidly in the gallery, his jaw locked. He had not expected public humiliation. The press whispered at the back of the room. The hearing had become theater, but of a kind no one wished to star in. When Claire finished, the courtroom fell into a silence that felt deeper than sound. Daniel's lawyer stood and attempted to recover ground, invoking words like vindictive destruction, disproportionate response, and emotional distress. He gestured toward Evelyn. This woman, he said, acted as judge and executioner of her own grievance. Evelyn did not move. When the judge turned to her and asked if she wished to address the court, she rose with quiet precision. "I acted," she said, "within the law and with evidence. I did not forge, I did not steal, I did not deceive. The house was not a gift. It was my company's property, my design, my signature on every beam. What I did was remove a structure that had already been hollowed by deceit. That is not vengeance. That is restoration of integrity." Her voice carried neither anger nor triumph. It carried clarity. The judge studied her for a long moment, then spoke. "This court has reviewed the evidence. The forgery allegations are substantiated. The request for injunction is denied. The matter of fraudulent conveyance is dismissed. However, the destruction of the shared residence remains a moral wound, if not a legal one. There are consequences beyond law, Ms. Shaw. I hope you understand that." Evelyn inclined her head. "I do," she said. The gavel struck once. The sound echoed like a closing door. Outside, cameras flashed. Claire shielded her with a hand on her arm. "It is not a victory," she murmured. "It is a verdict." In the following days, the ripple of the judgment moved through the city. Newspapers published cautious summaries. Commentators spoke of empowerment and ethics, of a woman who had demolished her own home to expose corruption. Others spoke of vengeance disguised as virtue. Evelyn did not read most of them. She had learned that public perception was a wave that consumed its own noise. Leela vanished from the news. Her father, Richard Ashford, withdrew all legal action quietly. In a single terse statement to the press, he said, "The matter is closed." His firm ceased its countersuit. The implied message was simple: retreat before greater exposure. He had seen enough evidence to understand that further pursuit would stain more than it would save. Daniel, stripped of professional standing, faced an internal corporate inquiry. His employer suspended him. Within a month, reports surfaced that he had resigned and left the city. Rumor suggested that he lived now in a small coastal town, working in a position far below his former salary. The law did not imprison him, it simply rendered him irrelevant. George Shaw came to see Evelyn one afternoon after the verdict. The wind off the harbor was sharp, carrying the faint scent of salt and cold steel. He waited outside her office, hat in hand, as though standing before a threshold he had no right to cross. When she saw him through the glass, she opened the door herself. He looked smaller than she remembered. Time had gathered him in folds and hesitations. He said, "I wanted to see you. Not to talk about the trial, about us." They sat in the office's small meeting room where models of buildings stood like frozen dreams. He turned a paperweight in his hands, nervous, and finally spoke. "I thought success would protect you. I did not see how lonely you were in that house. I did not see the way your mother's approval mattered more to me than your peace." Evelyn listened. The years of distance lay between them like dust. She said, "You saw what you were ready to see. We all did." He said, "I am ready now. If you can forgive an old man who mistook silence for wisdom." She looked at him, seeing not perfection but effort. She said, "I can, because you came." They sat without words for a while, letting the hum of the city replace what had been unsaid for decades. Margaret, by contrast, refused the call to introspection. Her circle of friends dwindled. Whispers followed her at the club. She clung to the notion that Evelyn had humiliated the family. Yet in private, she avoided her reflection. Once, Anna told Evelyn that their mother sometimes sat for hours looking at the old wedding photograph and murmuring, "I only wanted us to look happy." Evelyn understood that this was punishment enough. Some reckonings arrive without gavel or verdict. Anna herself moved toward a quiet redemption. She called an evening, her voice uncertain. "I don't expect you to forget," she said, "but I want you to know that I have begun to see you. For the first time, without Mother's voice in my head." Evelyn listened. They spoke for an hour, and for the first time in years, laughter entered their conversation. Fragile, but real. Ethan found work with a restoration company. He sent her a text with a photo of an old building he was helping to repair. "Learning to rebuild, one wall at a time," he wrote. She smiled. It was, in its own small way, an inheritance more valuable than any financial one. Evelyn's own rebuilding began not with concrete, but with quiet. Therapy sessions became a map through which she explored the terrain of consequence. Her therapist, a calm woman with an almost architectural precision of language, asked her not what she had done, but what she had
Felt after doing it. "Guilt?" the therapist asked. "Something colder," Evelyn said. "An emptiness, perhaps. Like walking through a house after the furniture has been removed."
The walls still stand, but they do not echo the same. You thought demolition would close the wound? The therapist said gently. I thought truth would. And did it? Evelyn paused. Truth is a light, she said finally, but it burns before it warms. The sessions did not heal her so much as they revealed her humanity, the fragile blend of justice and grief that had guided her hand. She began to accept that righteousness, even when justified, carries its own cost. Natalie remained her anchor. They met for coffee each Sunday at a small cafe near the waterfront. One morning, Natalie brought a young woman named Sarah, a new architect, bright-eyed and restless, recently hired at Shaw & Co. She reminds me of you, Natalie said. Evelyn studied Sarah's sketches, bold, full of lines that dared gravity. She smiled. You build without fear, she told the girl. That is a good beginning. But remember, every structure must also learn to bear its own weight. From that day, Evelyn began mentoring Sarah. Teaching became her quiet redemption. In guiding the young, she rediscovered the gentleness that ambition and betrayal had hardened. Months passed. The legal echoes faded. The escrow funds, once frozen in partial protection, were released. With them came possibility. Harborview Tower, her proudest project, opened to critical acclaim. Its design, once dismissed as too daring, now drew praise for its balance of glass and gravity. The press called it a cathedral of light. Invitations arrived for lectures, interviews, panels. Evelyn declined most of them. She spoke only once at a local university where she addressed a room of students. Architecture is not the act of making walls. It is the act of creating space for truth. Sometimes we build, sometimes we remove. Both are forms of design. The audience rose in applause, not for spectacle, but for sincerity. With the proceeds from the lot sale and the final settlement, she founded a small community grant, the Willow Scholarship, dedicated to supporting young architects who sought to design affordable, sustainable homes. She placed the fund quietly, without press, without her name on the plaques. It was her answer to the question that had haunted her since the day of the demolition. What could be built from ruin? The empty lot itself transformed. In time, under her design and Tom Hardy's investment, a cluster of townhouses rose. They called it Monroe Commons. Simple lines, generous light, open courtyards, an echo of her philosophy. Spaces for healing, not hiding. On the day of the ribbon cutting, children ran through the courtyard, laughter filling what had once been a field of dust. As the ceremony ended, Evelyn stood apart, watching. Tom joined her. You could have named it after yourself, he said. No, she replied. It should belong to the living. He nodded, understanding. One evening, months later, as autumn gilded the city, Evelyn stood on the balcony of her small office overlooking the harbor. The air carried the scent of wood and salt. The skyline burned with light, her buildings, her legacy, her choices etched against the dusk. Her phone vibrated. The name on the screen stopped her breath for a moment. Daniel. The message was short. I am sorry. I did not know what I was destroying until it was gone. Evelyn read it once. Then she typed her reply, slow and deliberate. Sorry. Once it is old, it is dead to me. She paused, then added nothing. She blocked the number and placed the phone face down on the desk. There was no satisfaction in the gesture, only completion. She poured herself a small glass of wine and stepped outside again. The harbor shimmered beneath her. Across the water, Harborview Tower's windows caught the last sunlight and threw it back toward her, as if returning a blessing. In that moment, she felt neither triumph nor regret, but only a stillness, vast and human. She had acted, suffered, rebuilt. She carried scars that did not ache, but taught. The city she had shaped had, in turn, reshaped her. Below, the hum of evening traffic mingled with the laughter of people walking home. The world continued, indifferent, alive, beautiful. Evelyn raised her glass toward the skyline. The gesture was not a toast to victory. It was an acknowledgement of survival, of imperfection, of design. The city lights flickered, reflections bending across the water like moving constellations. She smiled faintly as the wind lifted her hair. Behind her, in the office, the drafts for a new project lay open. A public library for a neighborhood that had lost one years ago. The sketches showed light pouring through high windows, corridors shaped for quiet voices. In the margin of the drawing, she had written a single line: "Rebuild with grace." The light from the harbor touched the page. For a long moment, Evelyn stood between what had been destroyed and what was yet to rise, the quiet architect of her own renewal. Then, she turned off the office light, leaving the page to glow in the fading sunset. And the city, faithful, imperfect, alive, breathed around her, holding its silence and its music as one. She learned in the quiet after the dust settled that some demolitions are not about anger, but about clarity. The house that once was a vessel for vows and small domestic rituals became in the end a ledger of payments made, of promises unkept, of a life built unevenly. When she set the machines in motion, she was not performing a spectacle for a crowd. She was following the austere rules of evidence and endurance, the same rules that she had practiced for decades as an architect. The act removed more than timber and plaster. It removed the tolerance she had long given to being unseen. There is a lesson here that does not wear the sharp face of vindication. Truth, when exposed, is not always warm. It can be a clean, hard light that reveals what must be rebuilt. Evelyn discovered that justice pursued with care is rarely instantaneous relief. It is slow, it is expensive, it asks for patience, for counsel, and for the documentation of every small thing you once considered private. She learned to translate heartbreak into discretionary steps: confirm, document, consult, then act. That order kept her from turning grief into ruin for its own sake. Yet there is another lesson beneath that one. Power without empathy is brittle. The demolition solved a wrong and created space, but it also left an emptiness that could not be filled by reparation alone. Healing required work that no court could mandate: confession, humility, small reconciliations, and the courage to build again with softer hands. In the rubble, she found the raw materials not only to finance new buildings, but to invest in what she most needed: community, mentorship, and a practice of architecture that honored people as much as form. If this story moves you, consider what it asks of you: to measure your relationships as carefully as you measure your commitments, to preserve evidence where promises feel uncertain, and to choose action that aims at restoration rather than spectacle. Tell us in the comments, where would you draw the line between justice and revenge? Share a moment when truth forced you to rebuild. If you want more stories like this one, thoughtful and true to life, subscribe and join the conversation. Your voice helps shape what we build next.